Dr. Dana Wessell Lightfoot. Tell me a little bit about yourself.
Hi, so I'm a professor of medieval and early modern history at the University of Northern British Columbia, which is in a very stereotypical Canadian place with lots of snow and moose and bears around in Prince George, BC. And I teach classes on medieval and early modern European history, broad survey classes, but also I'm really interested in thinking about questions around gender, medieval gender. I teach a lot of classes on witches and witch hunts, and then also on Jews in medieval Europe. And then the other part of my teaching really focuses on how medieval history is understood in popular culture. So I teach a course on Monty Python and history, and then I teach a course as well on Game of Thrones. So as a historian, as a scholar, as a scholar, my research focuses on women and gender in late medieval Spain. So I've looked at the experiences of lower status women. That was sort of the first work that I did, particularly in the city of Valencia, which is on the Mediterranean in the 15th century. And then right now I'm engaged in a collaborative project with Alexandra Garrison, who teaches at the University of Toronto, on Jewish women and conversas, so women who converted to Christianity in late medieval Girona, which is in northeastern Spain in Catalonia. And we're looking at those women during a moment of crisis in their community.
How did you get into that topic or the Middle Ages in medieval history in general?
It's kind of a funny story, I guess, weird. It's actually through an ex-boyfriend, which is really strange. He had this book on his bookshelf about Eleanor of Aquitaine, and it was a popular history about her, Eleanor of Aquitaine and the Four Kings by Amy Kelly. And I read this book and I thought, I had no idea that there were women like her that existed in the medieval period, women who had power and authority and had lots of property and had lots of influence. So after I read that book, I thought, well, I wonder if there's any, I was in my undergrad at the time. And so I started taking classes on medieval history, and not a lot of my medieval history classes had topics on gender. You know, they might talk about women very briefly, but not very much. But my professors did allow me to do research projects into women's history. So kind of from there, that's where my interest developed. But I came to look at Spain specifically because in the last year of my undergrad, I met a professor who worked on medieval Spain. And I talked about my interest in women's history, and he said, you know, there's not very many women or many scholars that are working on medieval women's history in Spain right now. So there's lots of things you could do, and I think you should think about that for graduate school. And then he also said to me, you know, if you do that, you get to go and live in Spain for a year. And that seemed very exciting to me because prior to that, I was working on medieval England, and he was like, well, you could go live a year in Spain where it's warm and sunny rather than going to live in England where it's cold and rainy. And so that kind of hooked me, and he connected me with a topic, and I ended up actually working with him for my PhD too.
Wow, no, we have a lot in common because it was a college professor in college history classes that got me into Middle Ages rather than popular culture or Dungeons and Dragons. And then graduate school, I also steadily gravitated southward to the Mediterranean for no good reason.
Well, I mean, and I think too, it's so, there's just lots of really interesting things in the Mediterranean too.
Yeah. Well, how familiar or unfamiliar as a teacher to you is it the way that your students come to the Middle Ages? Do you think there's something similar that draws them, or are there other things that attract people today?
I think it's a few different things. I think some of my students come to my medieval classes because they're really into representations of the Middle Ages in popular media. So I have lots of students that come to my classes because they watch shows like Game of Thrones, and they're really interested to find out if that's what life was really like in the Middle Ages. Or lots of them play video games, many different types of video games set in the Middle Ages. And so they're kind of drawn by that. I also teach at a pretty small university, and there's only 5 faculty in my department. And so we don't have a huge diversity of classes. And so some students come into that class because they took, the first year survey with me, world history survey with me. And so some of the things we talked about in that class, they were really interesting to them. And so they want to learn more about what happened to that. And then sometimes it just works for them for their schedule, right? I think that's the case with I actually get a lot of science majors in my medieval Europe class who take it as an elective, a humanities elective. And I'm not quite sure why. I think part of it is sort of, I had a group of students that took it in the past, and then they sort of told their friends that they should to take it. But I think also some of them are really interested to see, what was science like in that time period, and how is it different from today?
Well, what kind of ideas or preconceptions do you find students bring with them into classes?
I think the biggest one, and the one I spend the most amount of time in my classes trying to kind of unpack and root out of their system of belief, is that the Catholic Church was an evil institution that had control over every aspect of every person's life, and that their lives were very constrained in the way that people could act and the way that they could work and engage with one another, and that it was kind of like this all-seeing institution that no one could resist. And so I spend a lot of time in my classes talking about how the church developed, and how particularly they seem to think the papacy is this evil institution, right? So I spent a lot of time talking about, the church had very little power for a long time, and it took itself a while to get organized, and that it was very diverse, that it was different depending upon where you lived and your experiences with it. And its doctrine was very diverse, and the people who worked within it were very different from one another, and that it had many different roles in society. So that seems to be the biggest misconception that my students come to class with. And also that it was always an organ of persecution, right? That there was no other aspect to it. So I try and spend some time showing them there's not an easy answer to thinking about the church, right? And it's very complicated, and there's lots of contradictions, and people just live with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think most medieval history professors are probably surprised early on how much they find themselves defending the Catholic Church.
Yeah,
it feels like one of your jobs.
Yes, it's really weird, and I find when I teach early modern Europe courses too, they're just waiting for the Protestant Reformation to happen, right? And everything's solved, and it's like, well, not really. So yeah, I think that's one of the main misconceptions my students come to classes with.
Well, your own research it's very diverse, but a lot of it deals with gender, sexuality. And I wondered what if any notions of medieval gender roles or sexuality that students bring with them that you find yourself addressing.
Yeah, so there's a few different things. The first of them is that many of my students arrive with this conception that women's lives, much like everyone else's lives that they feel, but particularly women, that women were very subjugated, they were oppressed, they had no access to political or economic or social rights, that their lives were completely controlled by the men in their families, and that they really weren't able to do anything. And coupled with that is they have this conception that women's entire life was within the domestic sphere, and that they didn't work. The number of times my students have written, especially early on in classes, that women never worked in the Middle Ages, that they, and so one of the things I like to talk to them about is, women did all kinds of different, there's lots of different types of women, right? And so women's access to all of these things, political, economic, and social power, really depended a lot upon social status, and then also potentially on religion. but that we also need to think about the fact that there are many different types of women, right? And the ways that they are able to access agency in their lives really depended upon their particular circumstances. So we can't tar all women with the same brush. The second point that I think they come to class with that is perhaps a misconception is they have this idea that gender was binary in the Middle Ages. So there was male and there was female, and that was it. And that people didn't think about the fact there were multiple genders. And that they also seem to think that people that were transgender or non-binary didn't exist in that time period. And that's just simply not true, right? We know that gender in the medieval period was thought of in this binary way ideologically, but that in practice, we see many, many multiplicities of the way that they conceptualize gender and sexuality as well, right? That not everyone was heterosexual, that there were people that were across the LGBTQ spectrum as well, just like there are today, right? They seem to think these are modern conceptions, and this is not also not true. And then the last thing I would say is that for some reason, they seem to think that people only had sex within heterosexual marital relationships. And again, I think this kind of comes back to this belief about the Catholic Church as this all-seeing panopticon kind of thing, that you know, sexuality outside of marriage was sinful and people were punished very harshly for it. And again, that's just not true, right? We know people had lots of sex. They had lots of sex with people who they weren't married to, both before and after marriage. And sometimes they got in trouble for it, and sometimes they didn't. And so it kind of depended upon a particular situation. So I say these are the three most misleading things about sex and gender in the Middle Ages that I experience in my classes.
Yeah. Well, speaking of medieval people having lots of sex, you've taught a class on Game of Thrones. How did that go? Game of Thrones was when the series came out, was generated controversy for various things, but usually it was about the depictions of sex and sexual violence in that film. So how do you think about that with students in a historical context or in a, you know, representational context?
Yeah, Game of Thrones is an interesting show to use as a teaching tool, because I think it you know, George R. R. Martin, when writing the book series, claimed that he read all this stuff on the Middle Ages, mostly on England. And so he was really inspired by all these ideas. But when we think about the show itself is both based on what Martin wrote in his books, but then also based on the vision of the producers, right? And so how they thought about the Middle Ages. And they seem to really think that one of the things that had to be represented, and this is in the books too, I would say, is sexual violence, right? That women were constantly and in danger of being raped every time they stepped out the door. And that all women, regardless of who they were vulnerable to this. And it is true, there was sexual violence in the Middle Ages, and that women were sexually assaulted, not infrequently. How our understanding of that is really hampered by the sources that we have access to, because, you know, rape cases did not come before the courts very often. But the other thing that Game of Thrones did, I think, particularly in this show, was that it seemed to think that there were certain types of sexual violence that had to be represented in order for it to be authentic. And the showrunners talked about that in interviews too, right? So for example, spoiler alert, that they decide at one point in time to have one of the lead characters, Sansa Stark, when she's forcibly married to Ramsay Bolton, they added in a scene of where he rapes her on their wedding night. That's not in the books. That was created by them. The other thing about that particular scene is that the entire scene is seen through the image of a male character, of Theon Greyjoy as Reek. The whole scene is filmed looking at his face, with the sounds of the rape going on in the background.
Mm.
So that's super troubling, because our interpretation of the sexual violence is done through the vision of a male character. But the two, they got a lot of criticism for that from the public. But the showrunners said that they did it because it needed to be authentic to the Middle Ages, right? That this is something that would have happened, and that's really problematic, because again, it emphasizes women as objects, women as having no agency, sexual violence against women as the norm, and that's just not true.
Well, lastly, I want to ask what, besides Game of Thrones, and maybe Game of Thrones is even in the top 10 for you, what are your favorite forms or a specific example of medievalism, whether it's in game form or movies or TV? Is there anything that you consistently enjoy, or that you've enjoyed recently?
There's actually a series of novels that I wanted to talk about. So there's a Canadian fantasy author by the name of Guy Gabriel Kay, and he writes historical fantasy novels that are set in the Middle Ages, but in an alternate universe. So they're recognizable for the places that they are, but they're not called the same thing. So my favorite of all of those novels, he has ones that do deal with medieval France, and he has his more recent series deals with late medieval Italy. He has one on Byzantium, or series on Byzantium, but my favorite one is on Spain. It's called The Lions of Alrazan. And it's set in this alternative medieval Spain, right at the moment when there's this sort of massive conflict between Christians and Muslims. And so his focus is really to think about, how do these three religions live together? So the three main characters are a Christian, a Muslim, and a Jew, although they're all called different things. And one of the characters, the Christian character, is based on the historical El Cid. So it's kind of an interesting representation of, the thing I really like about that novel is that the characters are very real. They're very authentic to how people would have acted in the Middle Ages, but he gives them agency in different ways, right? So the female character is a doctor, and she has a lot of control over her own life, and what she does and how she interacts with people. So it's a really wonderful novel, and I really would encourage everyone to read. But all of his books are great, and he does a lot of historical research when he writes them.
Great. Well, I love doing these interviews because I get to add to my reading list.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for taking time to talk to me today.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to. Thank you so much.
Thanks.